we have had a popular theology of baptism in which it is seen, perhaps sometimes unconsciously, as a kind of individual salvation. I was a missionary priest in Puerto Rico for the first 10 years of my ministry, and the very first baptism which I performed embodied that attitude so profoundly that it affected, I have to say, the rest of my life. It was a critical turning point for me because the godparents had brought the little baby boy for me to baptize. It was conceived entirely as a private, individual event for the baby and for the family, not for the parish, and no obvious way that it related that child to the life of the church. This went on for hundreds of years. Now, one can say that, well, of course, we know that baptism is incorporation of the church. It does no good to say we know that if, in fact, we never embody it. And if the family and the children who are baptized never experience the fact that their baptism related them in a fundamental way to the life of the body of Christ. That individualization of baptism has a long history, which I will not go into detail here, but I think it is significantly related to the fact that the church got hung up on a rather perverse understanding of what was called original sin. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, baptism took place at Easter or at Pentecost. In other words, in its practice, the church is saying that this baptism is related to the dying and rising of Christ and to the gift of the Holy Spirit. But a theology developed, unfortunately, under the influence of St. Augustine, which said that a newborn infant is tainted with original sin, and that the only way to deal with that sin and keep the infant from going to hell if it should die was that it be baptized. There is no evidence at all of such an attitude in the earliest teaching of the church. And the practice of the church makes clear that bishops and pastors and leaders in the church did not rush to get a newly born infant baptized to protect it from some form of sin, or the idea that if the child was not baptized, it would be going to hell. But that idea, unfortunately, rooted itself in the popular awareness of the people, and undoubtedly pastors, whether bishops or parish clergy, encouraged parents to have their newborn infants baptized as soon as possible. And we have evidence then for centuries of the practice that as soon as the child is born, it would be baptized, often on the same day or as soon as possible, in order not to risk the danger of death unbaptized. That dominated the understanding of Christians in general for centuries. And I think it's still out there. I certainly encountered it in my early ministry in Puerto Rico, and I've encountered it in the United States. It is deeply set in what one might call popular theology, but it is also a deeply erroneous theology, and I think dangerous in its implications for our understanding of the relation of baptism to membership in the body of Christ. Baptism is incorporation. The effect of baptism on the child is to bring the child into the community of those who profess faith in Jesus Christ. It's the faithful community that this newborn infant is then incorporated into. So yes, it is doing something to the child. It's incorporation into the community of the redeemed. But it is also a very significant event in the life of the community. It's not a one-way street. The community is changed by the incorporation of a newborn person who comes with all the mysterious gifts and potential that God gives to each of us to be unfolding and then realized within the life of the church. So it is really corporate in its essential nature in every direction. When I was ordained, I had had the benefit of a rector who was a superb parish priest, and he was my model. And I had a very high regard for the ordained priesthood. I still do. And if anything, at that early period in my own ordination, I don't think I ever thought about the fact that ordination was superior to baptism. But in a sense, the attitudes of people around me in my own parish was that I had moved a step higher. This recovery of a baptismal ecclesiology is not only a theological development in my own thinking. I have to say it's a profoundly personal one, because I had been a priest probably between 10 and 15 years when I came to the realization that the most important event in my life in terms of God's action toward me had been when I was embraced by the waters of baptism. And that it was not that my ordination was in any way unimportant, but it was within that larger context that I could fully understand the meaning of ordination vows in the context of the baptismal promises. So there's a deeply personal aspect to this in my own life, and why I really approach this question with a great deal of passion, because it's part of my own personal history. I was constantly learning step by step. This didn't happen overnight. And I think this was true of the subcommittee as we worked. We came to see more. It was very much like an image that I use often in class, that a person is climbing a mountain, and at that point they see only the mountain. But when you get to the top, you see there are 6 other mountains. But until you're up there, you don't see it. I think this was very much true in our work together on this commission, that in fact, as we worked, we came to see more clearly what the questions were. And I don't think at that time, to the best of my memory, I do not recall anyone using the terms baptismal ecclesiology. It may be that I contributed to that myself, because I have, in my own work in initiation theology, come to realize that if you put initiation in its proper place, everything shapes itself around that focus. I'm reminded of an article written by my dear friend and colleague, the late Jim Griffiths, an article written many years ago about sacramental grace. And he uses the image in that article that initiation is like the floor and walls of a room. It's the framework in which everything else happens. Our life unfolds within that room, but the shape of the room and the context is established by the floor and walls of the room. I feel very strongly that is what happens in Christian initiation. I am still trying to learn more fully to live the meaning of my baptism. In my case, that involves living it as an ordained priest, but it is with reference to that more fundamental reality, my identity with Christ through baptism. one of the major contributions of the 79 book, and it is a first stage in a way, and a beginning of a process, was to address the problem of clericalism. And in many ways, the 79 book is a significant step in the direction of, as I would say, putting the clergy in their place, in our place. And I say that as someone for whom ordination is a very significant part of who I am. I'm not denigrating ordination at all, but it does need to be kept in its place. And we have an inherited tradition of a kind of clericalism that is often very subtle, even among those who are committed to the emergence of lay leadership in the church. I still see occasionally, in others and in myself, a reaction that says, well, but of course the ordained know this better. And I think we still have a long way to go on that. Often people will speak in the Roman Church of the excessive clericalization in the Roman Church, where everything is a hierarchical model. In our own way, we are just as clerical. Some differences are important, I think, but nevertheless, we also suffer from an idea that ultimately it is the ordained person who calls the shots. An authentically collegial approach to the life of the church means a willingness to accept, and maybe one of the great gifts of a pastoral leader is to discern the gifts within a community and to encourage the development and expression of those gifts by laity. If I had been called to be a parish priest, I hope I could have embodied that, where I would do the ministry that I was called to do of sacramental leadership, preaching and teaching, but to have working with me lay leaders, and I hope also deacons, who would have special gifts, and they would exercise those gifts also for the benefit of the common life of the church. There's been a very exciting experiment of that with which I've been involved ever since the early 80s, when Bishop Tom Ray became Bishop of Northern Michigan. Tom and I were in seminary together. And when this was beginning, he came down to visit me at the Shoten House where I was teaching at the time. And it was a very exciting evening because he recognized that the traditional model of the structure of ministries in a diocese was economically impossible for the Diocese of Northern Michigan. It was a very brave decision, which his two predecessors, both of whom I knew, both of whom were marvelous bishops, marvelous human beings, had not really taken that bold step. And Tom said it must change. And to a great extent, that has happened in the life of that diocese, is to recognize that all of our ministries, both lay and ordained, are ultimately complementary, and that the goal of all of them is the building up of the common life within the community and the service of the extensive community where we are planted. And when we claim that, we recognize that each one of us has only certain specific gifts and certain limitations. We need each other's gifts. And the clerical model tends to suffocate that, and ministry becomes what the priest does or wants to do or is able to do. And that is a terrible diminishing of the idea of what ministry is.
Boone Porter wrote an article one time that was called the Omnivorous Priesthood, which talked about how in the Middle Ages priesthood had eaten the entire rest of the ministry. Ministers were priests. Bishops were just super priests who could ordain more priests. And deacons were intern priests who had to learn more before they could be real priests. But they were probationary priests, sort of. But the ministry and priesthood were the same thing. And we've been very clear in trying to say that ministry and priesthood are not the same thing. The basic ministry, and this appears also in baptism, Eucharist, and orders from the World Council of Churches. Baptism, Eucharist ministry is the right title, which makes it very clear that it's the ordained ministry is dependent upon the ministry of the church, and the church's ministry is the ministry of the baptized members of the church. That the presiding bishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the Pope are not any more ministers of the church than the newly baptized Christian. Sometimes not so much. But this is the way it works. And the ordained ministry are members of the body of Christ who God has directed to fulfilling these representative ministries within the church. The diaconate is actually the first of these ministries in that sense, in that it is, as St. Ignatius said, of Antioch, not Ignatius Loyola, that Ignatius said that the deacons had the ministry of Christ, because the deacon's ministry was ministering to the sick and the hungry, and to caring for the whole people of God, and seeing that the church did love its neighbors and care for those in need. That was the deacon's part. And as a matter of fact, I remember Boone Porter saying that this is why the deacon is assigned the prayers of the people. The priest and the bishop are trying to maintain an institution. The deacon is not. And for the deacon to stand up there and say, the war against Iraq is immoral and we must pray that we be delivered from it, which is something the rector probably wouldn't dare say because it would affect contributions. Not that I'm that cynical. Certainly the bishop wouldn't dare say it. But that this was the deacon's job to remind the people of these things in the congregation, and that's that piece of the ministry. The priest or the presbyter is the elder of the congregation. He really is the principal order, though, in that case, is the bishop, not the presbyter. The bishop is the one who presides over the local church and is the normal celebrant of baptism and the Eucharist and any other rites that come along. When congregations outgrew being a single parish, it became necessary to have some, and the presbyters, who were originally as the Presbyterians will tell you, were originally the people who assisted the pastor, in our case the bishop, in the administration of the church. I remember the description exactly, is they are the people who were willing to sit on the platform up front so that the police spies could identify them when they came to arrest people. That they were a committee, and they were sent to different congregations one at a time to be the local representative of the bishop, to do the pastoral work, to baptize and confirm in the bishop's name. In fact, in many places, it was, and throughout a lot of the Middle Ages, not every parish had a font. The bishop licensed fonts, and the rectors of those places that had fonts were the ones whom the bishops had authorized to do baptisms in his name. And the Spanish theologians, whom I happen to have read a lot of, I think this was Isidore of Seville, said that those who are baptized by the presbyter using oil consecrated by the bishop, the baptism is done as if by the hand of the bishop. And this became a big thing. The Spanish church, in fact, never got into confirmation. And it was from the Spanish church that Cranmer took his blessing of the font. And so it was well known at the time of the Reformation. It was not widely in use, but the Renaissance scholars had rediscovered all this stuff and were in the process of putting it out in printed editions. And Cranmer owned a copy. So we know that some of this stuff was going on at the time of the Reformation, and they were concerned about it. And we thought we should be concerned about it too. The stuff that Bonnie Spencer and I did by ourselves involved largely looking at all of the pre-Reformation Eastern and Western baptismal rites and talking about, now if we could put this together as a committee of two and assure that it would immediately receive the approbation of the whole world, then this is the way we would do it. And I am astounded at how much of that actually did make its way, although we used very little of the language, except for prayers that had already been translated into English and occurred in earlier books.
I've said to students probably for the last 20 or 30 years that I believe very firmly that the theological issue which dominated much of the debates about ministry in the 20th century really were a question of ecclesiology. What does it mean to be the church? What does it mean to be the body of Christ? And I think the issue is flowing over into the 21st century very clearly. Part of what it means to be the church, I think, is related to the discussion of baptismal ecclesiology. Because if you suddenly say that baptism is the fundamental rite of entry into the body, it places ordination in a very different perspective from what we inherited from the previous millennium for a very long time, in which somehow, and eventually in the High Middle Ages explicitly, holy order was viewed as superior to our membership in the body of Christ. Baptism was a kind of automatic event at the birth of a child because of the theology of original sin, and ordination became the great event, or in the life of a monk or a nun, life profession within a monastic community. These were the superior Christians. Now, I don't want to judge the Middle Ages. If I'd lived in that period and known the realities of that time, that may have been the only route the church could follow. I don't know. But I do know that for us, I think the very significant recovery of the centrality of baptism in the life of the church, and therefore in the life of each Christian, really is related to the placing of the right relationship between what ordination means in terms of priority within the life of the church as a whole. That baptism is foundational, is fundamental, in a way that ordination is particular. In other words, baptism is the sign for men, women, all in our society who are called through faith in Christ into a common faith community. Within that community, the work of discernment is to ask, now, what are the particular gifts that each person brings to the life of their particular community? And this means that suddenly ordination is a discernment from within the community that you, man, woman, whatever, manifest, embody the gifts that we believe call for ordination and call you to do this ministry. I love to use the example of the election of St. Ambrose to become Bishop of Milan. At the time he was elected bishop, he was not even baptized. He was a catechumen. He was preparing for baptism. But apparently, the community of Christians in Milan saw in him the gifts which they felt were needed within that local church and which therefore their new bishop needed to embody. And what happened was that Ambrose was baptized and then ordained a bishop. And people accustomed to our stepladder approach to ordination would say, oh, well, wasn't he ordained a deacon or priest first? There is no evidence at all that he was ordained anything but bishop. Why? Because the community had called him to that ministry because they discerned in him the gifts for that ministry. The idea of a stepladder to a particular higher office didn't even exist in the vocabulary. I'm reminded that in the 1928 rite of ordination to a deacon, that when I was ordained deacon, the concluding collect said that I should behave myself in such a way that I might aspire to higher order. That is very much the vocabulary of the later medieval church, namely that holy order is almost a separate entity within the life of the church with its own internal regulations, and that you enter at a very low point in the stepladder and then meet the requirements at each stage, and the church at each point gives you a new set of responsibilities, and if you don't fulfill those, then you stop at that point, and you stop the process. And of course, at the top was subdeacon in the medieval vocabulary. Subdeacon, deacon, and priest were understood to be the three major orders. Now, Anglicans will immediately say, well, our prayer book says that the bishop is the highest order. This was one of the brilliant strokes of Archbishop Cranmer, that he recovered the early Christian understanding that holy order, yes, it's threefold, but the top member of that order is the bishop, and then there were presbyters, priests, and deacons. The medieval model exercised a very strong influence in, I would say, sociologically within the culture. People in holy orders had different set of laws. They really were treated separately, differently from ordinary men and women. This would have been totally unknown during the early centuries of the church. And I think we are at a time now where, with our greater historical knowledge, that we say that we understand how the medieval model developed within the particular context of that culture, but that our faithfulness needs to be in terms of the underlying understanding of Holy Order as more clearly embodied, I believe, in the early centuries. And the ordination of Ambrose is a very good example of that, that the fundamental identity that men and women are called to is effected through baptism. And then within the large community, rather than seeing the bishop as the top of a pyramid, we see the bishop as the hub of the wheel. And within the wheel being all of the baptized. And then the question becomes, what are the particular gifts that each man and woman brings to the life of the church at a given time in a given place? So it really is a very fundamental recovery of the understanding of Holy Order in relationship to the common life of the church. The Catechism says rightly, and if I remember correctly, we can credit that to Bishop Stanley Atkins. I think that he was the source of that, to list the laity as the first ministers of the church. And I really think this is something we still had not generally understood. A former student of mine, who is now the rector of a major Anglo-Catholic parish in New York, St. Mary the Virgin, which for many years had a highly clerical liturgy. The rector, Stephen Girth, has created an amazingly different atmosphere. Every Sunday, he reminds the community that they are the celebrants. He has a marvelous way of doing this. And the clergy are the servants of the assembly. That's his phrase. It is a transforming vocabulary. And he keeps saying it. He keeps saying it. And he believes it. And even in a parish laden with a heavy clerical tradition, it is having a gradual effect on the way the parish understands itself. It seems to me that this particular emergence within our own tradition is probably where I would invest myself most fully. And again, I came into it naturally, gradually, step by step. I have to say to you that in many ways, my commitment to baptismal ecclesiology is very closely related to my own personal life of faith. And it's what I said earlier, to realize that the most important thing in my life that God has done to me is his first gift, first tangible gift, and that is my identity as a member of the body. And so, you know, this at this point, you know, I'm at an age where there are not too many ditches I would die in. This one I would. I think it's that important. And I think many of the people I've taught over the years have caught a sense of that, and they go out to very diverse circumstances, and I can't possibly give them the answers to their particulars, but I think they can take the fundamentals and understand how they can unfold within a particular parish community. I'm not quite sure why American liturgists have embraced this as fully as we have when compared to other provinces. And I still think, for example, I look at the African church, and I hardly dare speak. I don't know it firsthand, but their understanding of ministerial authority is so very different, and it's shaped by factors that I don't understand. But it does create dissension when we have an international communion of provinces with very different understandings, and primarily about what ordination means. And it seems to me that if we could possibly find a common ground on the baptismal issue, that we might have a better hope of sorting out the ordination questions. Because basically what the American Church has said is that ordination is within the larger context of the mystery of baptism. And that opens a wholly different perspective of how we look at all the other issues. This includes ordination of women, ordination of gay and lesbian people. The question is, are they baptized? And does the community discern in them the gifts for this ministry? It's really very simple. It's really very simple. And, but it's not the experience universally. And I don't want to be arrogant, and I really don't. I accidentally occasionally am, and I don't want to be. I really don't want to be. But I have to be honest about the experience I've had and the work I've done. And I'm very nervous about restrictions that are made that seem to me to be based on false premises. And that concerns me. I'm also, frankly, as we've said earlier, I'm very anxious about the persistence of clericalism as an office of privilege. And it seems to me we're ordained to service, not to privilege. And I've experienced that when, I can remember over the years, occasions where I benefited from the fact that someone knew I was a priest. I got a discount or something, whatever. A few years ago, I gave the lecture for the Week of Christian Unity in Rome. It's an annual event. And I was the lecturer. And because I was the lecturer, I was invited to the papal audience the day before my lecture. And I was told, since I was an invited guest, I would sit on the first row, which meant I would meet the Pope. And my student and friend, Stephen Girth, the one I just mentioned, rector of St. Mary's, flew over to hear me to give the lecture. And I said, well, I have a friend coming over. Can he come too? They said, of course, we'll arrange for 2 seats. And the audience chamber holds, I think, 10,000 people. It's enormous beyond imagination. And I asked my host, I said, what time do we have to get there? Because I know people arrive before 8 a.m. for a 10 o'clock audience. And he said, well, you're on the first row. You come in 5 minutes before the Pope. You just come in and we arrived, and I had the card, and I showed it to the Swiss guard, and he ushered me to the center aisle. And as we went down the aisle, about every 5th row, there was a Swiss guard. As we passed, we were saluted. All the way down, passing 10,000 people. And I turned to Stephen and I said, I could get used to this. Clericalism is insidious. That's a funny anecdote. It happened to me once, it'll never happen again. But if you live with that in any form, not just that extreme form, but in any form where you come to take for granted that because you're a priest, you're more important, is a death blow to authentic ministry, I think. And I have to fight it. I think it is a distinct ministry, and in that sense, I'm very traditional. I don't believe it's an upgraded layperson. I think rather it is that a priest is a person in whom particular gifts have been discerned, and there's not one narrow set of gifts, there's a whole range of gifts, and it depends a lot on the life of the community, that there are gifts that the community wants and searches for in its candidates, and occasionally it makes mistakes, and we know, all of us know people who have been ordained who have found it's not what I should have done, and they leave, and that's probably good for them and good for the church. But a priest has a particular role, I believe, in the life of the church, and I would focus it on the ministry of word and sacrament. Individual priests may have particular gifts that others don't have. You know, we have our own particularities, and that can be brought into your ministry in a particular community. But you know, if you're a rector with, let's say, particular gifts in dealing with young adults, one can't assume the next rector will necessarily have that gift. The next rector may have gifts working with children, or working with the poor, or the impoverished in the society, or in other words, gifts differ. So the question is, when you're a priest of a parish, that the question is a complementarity of gifts, because I believe all the gifts needed are in the community. I believe they're all there for that community, but they're not all on the ordained person. So that the particular gifts of the ordained members of the community also is held then in a kind of, I think, healthful tension with the gifts of other members of the community. And not that the gifts of the ordained have a priority by virtue of ordination, but all of them contribute to the upbuilding of the life of the community. I do believe ordination is the public response by the church to this discernment, and normally after some type of formation to equip the person for the expected ministry. But that ordination itself is a public act in which the church recognizes what God has already done. A Jesuit friend of mine said once, and it's a very confusing statement, I've used it with some hesitation because it's easily misunderstood, but John Gallen once said, if you're not a priest when you walk down the aisle, then you won't be one when you come back up the aisle. Now, understand what he said. He's not saying that the laying on of hands is meaningless. He's not saying that at all. But what he's saying is that the discernment and the gifting of the person precede the ordination. And then the decision of the bishop and that whole level is a response to what has already been given, at least in a starting way that you can discern, that you can see. And that then the public acclamation of that is what the ordination does. One of my professors in Paris, Father Cyril Vogel, said in class one day that the real essence of an ordination, he said, is not the laying on of hands, it's the proclamation that we believe God's will for this person and for the church. It's that person serve as a bishop or a priest or a deacon. And we are responding to what we believe to be God's will with a public act, a sacramental act, a profoundly human act of human touching, which has been used throughout the entire tradition. But it is not a magic act, it's a responsive act to what the community and all involved believe to be God's will. So it's a very interesting insight. He's not saying let's drop the laying on of hands. What he's saying is what is really going on is proclamation. What has been a somewhat individual event of a candidate and his or her family or the Commission on Ministry suddenly is a public event because it pertains to the life of the whole church. One of the great gifts of my bishop in Dallas before my ordination to the diaconate was when he said to me one day in a private conversation, he said, "Louis, you must be a priest of the whole church, not part of the church." I've kept that with me ever since. I've been involved in a reaffirmation of the diaconal order. I was shocked a few years ago when the Church of England seriously considered, since it had become a mere stepladder ministry, just dropping it. I remember saying to a priest in the Diocese of Milwaukee many years ago that if I were the rector of a parish, I could think of nothing I would like more than to be the rector overseeing Word and Sacrament and have maybe 6 or 8 deacons with particular gifts to do all the ministry, like the sick, the shut-ins, the children, education, social witness, all those, where the particular gifts were focused, and let the person do that as the link the parish to those other parts of the social context. And he said to me, he did a project for me. For a period of weeks, he kept a record of everything he did that was priestly or diaconal. And if I remember correctly, 80% of what he did, he said, could be defined as diaconal. That did not require that one be a priest, nor have any particular relation to ministry of Word and Sacrament, which was a sobering thought. Because in many ways, in the words of the late Boone Porter, the priesthood as it evolved in the Middle Ages became an omnivorous priesthood, and it gobbled up the diaconate, so that you would have people who were priests pretending to be deacons in the liturgy, which I find particularly abhorrent. Deacons have historically done almost any ministry you want to name, but not the normal sacramental ministry. But for example, in terms of the witness of the church in the world to widows, children, orphans, the dispossessed, the poor, they were the bridge people between the church and the larger society. That offers, I think, a reasonably good model, at least as a starting point for what a deacon is. Rather than seeing him as, a phrase I've used, a pre-priest. I was a deacon for 6 months because in Puerto Rico, where I was assigned, they needed a priest. So I had to call in a priest every weekend to come in and celebrate the Eucharist until I was ordained a priest. So in many ways, I was not a deacon, I was a pre-priest. And I realized the anomaly by living it. It just didn't make sense, you know. And so I have been very strong in wanting to support an authentic diaconate as one in which particular gifts that are not necessarily focused on Word and Sacrament are given an open rein and can be expressed. And it has functioned better in some places than others. This is true, I'm told, in Roman Catholic communities. Some places it's thriving, in other places it has not gone well. So I don't know all the variables. But it's certainly a biblical ministry. But let's face it, if you look at the New Testament, bishop as used in the New Testament, presbyter, priest, as used in the New Testament, and deacon as used in the New Testament, have gone through an enormous series of changes historically. I pointed out to a Roman Catholic friend here a few years ago, this is true of the papacy as well. He imagined that the early popes were all like John Paul II. That model of papacy is from the 19th century. And when I said, what model? He said, I can't imagine the church without the Pope. I said, well, I can understand that point of view, but I said, which model? And he looked at me as though I was speaking Swahili. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you surely don't think that the model of John Paul II has been the model for 2,000 years. Well, yes, I did. I said, well, you better read some papal history, because the papacy has changed and changed and changed and changed. Even in its continuities, it has been changing. So, and I would apply across the board to the threefold ministry of bishop, priest, and deacon, is that there is enormous historical evolution in those ministries, shaped by the needs of the church at a particular time and the particular gifts from within the community. The problem comes when the model gets rigidified and it no longer really fits the needs of the church. So then you get a kind of vestigial model with the idea, well, anyone can play deacon in the liturgy because it's not in any sense an identifiable reality. It's just what clothes you wear. Well, if that's what it is, let's abolish the whole thing, you know. I think we're talking about something underlying the ritual, and that is the pattern of ministry that deacons are called to do. And if you look at the history as a whole, it's been very diverse. Admittedly, for centuries, it was eclipsed under the priesthood. But prior to that, it was a very important ministry in the church. And there was real tension in the 3rd, 4th centuries between the presbyters and the deacons in terms of their influence. And the deacons were extremely influential. Now, we're not living with a single pattern. You know, there's a lot of development and change. Well, the word itself, I think, is helpful. A bishop is an overseer, and episkopos is an overseer. And even the word apostolos, apostle, is also often applied to the bishop. And that I would be more careful about, because it seems to me that apostolic applies to the church as a whole, that all of us in ministry may be called to particular forms of apostolic ministry, or as friends of mine have said, apostolate. But I would say the same thing about episcopate. I think we have limited the sense of it to who wears a pointed hat. And in fact, episcopate means, as I said, oversight. And I think not only do priests in a parish exercise oversight, deacons in certain contexts exercise oversight, and laity in certain contexts exercise oversight. A former student of mine from the church in Hong Kong, who is now a priest for about 20 years and still does it, was the director of a massive social service program in Hong Kong. 2,000 people are on her staff, ministering all over Hong Kong. She was an episcopa before she was ordained. She was an overseer of an enormous program. So I think we need to understand the underlying dynamic of the term that a bishop embraces in a particular way. And if you apply it specifically to a bishop, then normally it means the overseer of a given geographical area. And that is one which has generally, among Orthodox and Anglicans, been understood the Roman Church has the anomaly of naming bishops who hold administrative offices to episcopal sees that no longer exist. So you'll have a bishop of a town in North Africa that in fact doesn't exist, but in name, he is the episkopos of that diocese. In actuality, his ministry is in a Vatican department, you see. I would hate to see any confirmation of that pattern. It seems to me that the essential dynamic of a bishop is the chief pastor of a given geographical area. Now, there can be some derivatives of that, as for example, when we have a bishop of the Navajo Indians, because they form a clear identity, and it makes great sense to say, in that sense, they are a given area defined by their particular culture. So I wouldn't want to approach it rigidly, but it seems to me generally we're talking about responsibility, care, oversight for a particular definable community of people. Did the baptismal covenant of the American Prayer Book have a particular orientation for the American Church? It's very hard to tell in specific terms. There's no question that overall its frequency of use, not only at baptisms, but also at certain types of renewal liturgies, added, as I've seen, also in the context of ordination as well, puts the American Church in a particular baptismal framework in the unfolding of its life. I don't think that we have run the full path. I think, in a sense, we're just at the beginning of it. I was in a conversation about a year ago in England with Paul Avis, who is a very distinguished English theologian. And Paul, as an Englishman, we happily disagree. We're friends, but we happily disagree on the American model. He believes that baptism and confirmation are still the basic model for Christian identity. And he would argue that the Americans have gone off in a line that he finds unhelpful. I remember much earlier that when Michael Ramsey, after his retirement, spent periods of weeks at Nashotah House, that he also took the stand that even at that period, the American Church was somewhat on its own with regard to this issue of the baptismal model, the pattern of initiation. The only thing I can say is those of us who helped create that rite acted on the basis of the best theological and historical insight we could bring to it. And that insight is something which is really common to Anglicans around the world because it's a common resource. It's also common to other Christian traditions. But that does not mean that individual provinces or other churches are going to implement that in the same way. I will give one example. It is absolutely incredible to me that in the Roman Catholic Church, the communion of infants and small children has simply not emerged as a question. And I've discussed this with Roman Catholic friends professional liturgists. And the answer is that, first of all, it would not be tolerated at Rome. And again, that on the whole, it has not been broached even at the pastoral level. In the light of the documentation and the evidence of early centuries, as an American, I have to say I'm staggered by this. As an American Episcopalian, I'm staggered by this. I don't understand how one cannot raise the question and say, well, what about the integrity of the initiation process itself? Is not the early model at least a judge on what we are now doing? And so not only within the Anglican tradition as a whole, but also in the wider ecumenical level, we do see differences of practice that, in spite of our use of common historical resources, are implemented in different ways. In the English scene, in talking to Paul Avis, I find, as I found also with Michael Ramsey, a tremendous reserve about the practice of confirmation. I have no desire to abolish confirmation, but my concern is not to see it as initiatory, not to see it as entrance into reception of communion, because I think these are historically and theologically without a basis. But I'm speaking as someone who has gone through the process of reflection, as we have done from this early stage of the subcommission on Christian initiation, where we really worked very hard on what are the implications of the historical and theological evidence, and how do we deal with that in terms of a revision within the American Church. And I have had English friends in the field of liturgy say to me that the American Church had really gone off like a Lone Ranger, doing its own thing. On the other hand, I think we have acted not precipitously, but rather on the basis of rather substantial and careful reflection. And that, has led us to where we are. On the other hand, we have not fully embodied the implications of that even within the American Church. And that hinges back to the question of the, the deepening of that insight through more adequate forms of adult formation, where people can, in a sense, claim their faith in a more integral way.
I think that the 79 prayer book, by emphasizing the integrity of one's own sort of baptismal personhood as a active participant in the mystery of Christ in us, the hope of glory yet to be revealed, as an extension of Christ, as the sort of embodiment of the Spirit of Christ in one's own context. I think that's a very different emphasis. And I will say, I think sometimes the notion of penitence, if it's an invitation to examine my own biases, my limitations, my own rigidities, be they hideously conservative or wildly progressive, because both can be equally, mired in a kind of judging certitude. If there isn't some invitation to I call it self-scrutiny in the light of the gospel. I'm so afraid that we just sort of do our thing, albeit under the banner of Christ, but are we caught up with Satan masquerading as an angel of light? Are we discerning the spirits accurately within our own lives and our own responses to things? I mean, I see so much of what goes on in the church as sort of unawareness, these sort of knee-jerk reactions and these awful things people say to one another, these terrible judgments that are made about the integrity of various people and where they stand. And I think, you know, where is their self-awareness? Where is there an acknowledgement that one is seeing through, you know, particular filters that have to do with their own life experience and the limitation of, you know, everything that's shaped and formed them. So, I mean, without endlessly breast thumping and saying I'm a miserable worm, which I don't think is really what penitence is about, where is the invitation to a kind of mindfulness? I mean, I am a resurrection person, yeah, but where am I still in need of living the mystery of redemption? Where am I caught and stuck in my own fantasies of resurrectionness that are actually not of the gospel, but of my own sort of disordered psyche? You know, that kind of thing I think is important not to lose sight of. How am I shaped and formed as a faithful person and able to see beyond simply, am I seeking and serving Christ? Am I respecting the dignity of every human being? I mean, it's interesting how bits of the baptismal covenant will get used politically. And you just sort of think, okay, the moment you hear respect the dignity of every human being, you know what they're really talking about. And others won't be using that term. The other thing that's so interesting to me is that there are certain languages. There's the language of holiness and the language of justice. And we're at a point where if I speak the language of holiness and you're a justice speaker, you're going to be very suspicious and mistrusting of what I say. And you flip it around the other way as well. You know, it's a justice issue. Well, if you say that, you know, I know exactly where you stand. If you say it's a matter of holiness, I know exactly where you stand. So how do we become multilingual? Because justness and holiness are both part of the divine purview. And how can we speak in languages where instead of creating sort of separation, or that we actually can draw divergent points of view and divergent experiences together. So that's sort of, you know, I don't know quite how I got onto that, but that's part of something that I think is very, very important, and has to do with ecclesiologies too, very much so. I mean, the church is about justice, the church is about holiness. Well, I hope it's about both, you know, in some way. And then whose justice? You know, is it my sense of right ordering of something, or have I been so, what would I say, shaped and formed by the Spirit that my consciousness now reflects the justness of God rather than what I think ought to be done in this particular situation? Or is my sense of holiness a kind of, what would I say, protective purity that has very little to do with what the Spirit may be working in my consciousness if I allow the Spirit to give me a sense of God's own holiness, trying to sort of pour into the world around me. So. The future, I'm always careful not to indulge in hypothetical projections because I find they're often inaccurate. And I'm always amused by sort of the 5-year plan, the strategic 5-year or 10-year plan, and how frequently they have to be aborted because something that wasn't anticipated has occurred. And I mean, I think always one has to be sort of open to the future and, you know, have some sense of one's bearings and one's orientation toward that future. But I think being open to surprise and a sudden change in direction is part of the stance of fidelity these days. So, you know, I have no idea what the church is going to look like in the future. I think the limitations of the institution are more and more writ large. And so I see a more humble church. I mean, I look at something like the Washington Cathedral, and as beautiful as it is, I think it's a whole other view of the triumph of the church. And I think a stance of humility is really called for, and an awareness that God is already at work in the world around us, well beyond the borders of the church. The church doesn't bring God to the world. The church is to discern where God is already present. It's the whole notion of missionaries. How is Christ already there before you get there? And what is it you're called to acknowledge and reverence as opposed to impose out of your own sort of sense of rightness? So I'd say humility, openness to mystery and surprise, an interior flexibility that comes from a deep intimacy with Christ, and an awareness, in the words of Ecclesiastes, that God could do things in a crooked way, and that straight lines are not always the way in which grace happens, or my ways are not your ways, neither are your thoughts my thoughts, as Isaiah 55 puts it. So just being aware that mystery is always larger than our comprehension, and being open to being dazzled by it, discomfited by it, challenged by it is probably the way people of faith need to be toward the future. Life in community, I can say something about it in two ways. As a parish priest, it was my assumption that I was bringing Christ, bringing the Word to the congregation. And I remember becoming rector of a small church in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and soon realizing, because the church was very intimate, it only seated 120 people, and so it was sort of like a living room, unlike the church I'd been in before, which was quite large, and when you got up to preach, lights dimmed and spotlights came on the preacher. So you really had a sense of performance. But in this other church, you were sort of in a living room with people. And so body language was quite obvious. And I realized after a while that the congregation was pulling the Word out of me, often by sort of looking surprised or unsure when I was saying, and so I'd sort of see a frown, and then I'd depart from my text and say something was a surprise to me, but it was life-giving to, and I thought, actually, this is all dialogical. I mean, I may be the presider, but the interactions are all part of how the Word is happening in our midst. And so I've realized over time that I was being shaped and formed by the congregation, just as I was shaping and forming them. That it was a very mutual sort of experience. And then that's, of course, too, where finally I let people write the prayers, which was a whole other piece of discovery of mutuality. And I would say the same was true with being a bishop, a diocesan bishop. I mean, very much a sense of, yes, I was the bishop, but the interactions with the clergy particularly were very sort of mutual, and the congregations. And I mean, I was always aware of bishops who said, oh, you know, I can't wait to get out of my diocese, you know, I can only talk to other bishops. And I thought, well, if a diocese is in fact a fractal representing the body of Christ, then if the bishop doesn't feel at ease, or doesn't feel that the life of the gospel is happening holistically within the diocese in a life-giving way for the bishop, then something's very wrong here. So, I mean, when I was in Chicago, I used one of the priests of the diocese as my confessor rather than going outside, and you know, really saw the clergy and lay people as the church, rather than, oh, you know, I'll do all this sort of administrative or liturgical stuff, but my real life is with other bishops somewhere else. It's also why I very seldom wore purple, because I just felt, I mean, I remember clergy saying, thank you so much for not setting yourself apart from us. But I mean, I could have worn a necktie, and lay people have said, thank you so much for not setting yourself apart from us. However, so how, I mean, it has a lot to do with being able to say, Christ is present in the community. Now, how is Christ showing up? But you've got to have some expectation of that, I think. I mean, I've been shaped and formed by criticism. You know, it's not all, Frank, you're wonderful, and you're the most marvelous bishop or the most wonderful parish priest we've ever had. I mean, why the hell did you do this? And, you know, I so disagree with that. You know, or what did you mean when you were talking about thus and so? I mean, all those things are so important in bumping you up. Or even the man who said the kiss of death and put the hymnal over his head. I mean, lest I feel that I was the paragon of liturgical, you know, whatever, you know, here was this guy who was not happy with what was going on, and I thought, well, that's good for you, Frank. I mean, you haven't won over everyone. And the head of the altar guild who said, our job is to take care of the altar, but in this church you never know where it's going to be from Sunday to Sunday. But you know, this kind of thing was very good for leveling you. And it's really, I think, at a deeper level, it's Christ encountering you through the people and saying, just remember, you're my servant here. Just remember that we're all together in this, and you are part of this community, and they are part of you. And I'm working through them just as I'm working through you. I'm equally present in them, though in different ways. So.